World War II shaped the lives of a generation. The war broke families apart, brought communities together, and turned a depressed economy into an industrial machine. On the home front, citizens sold war bonds and collected scrap metal for the factories. Friends were made and lost as a generation of boys was sent into combat. Penn State Public Broadcasting invited those who lived this history to share their stories of World War II.
My name is Jack Purnell, and I come from Mifflinburg, Pennsylvania. And it was during the war years that I grew up in Mifflinburg. I was at the onset of the war. I was 12 years old, and at the end of the war, I was 18 and just about ready to be drafted. So I never did get drafted because the war ended at that point. Actually, the war started for me as a little 12-year-old on a Sunday afternoon listening to the Giants football game, when all of a sudden the game stopped and the announcement came that we'd been attacked by Pearl Harbor. Now, at 12 years of age, I didn't mean a lot to me, but my father was there and my uncle, and they were discussing it, and I knew it was something pretty serious, but I couldn't quite comprehend it at that point. So that was the beginning of the war for me. The next point that brought the war home to me was a year later when I was in high school. A young man from our high school was the first person in Center County in Union County to get killed. And that brought it home because everybody talked about it. The teachers knew him and so forth. Personally, I didn't know him myself, but everybody, the other folks did. And that really brought the war home to us. That really, it wasn't just over there. It was now in Mifflinburg, too. One of the things that we did during the war was to gather up newspapers. Everybody in town would gather up their papers and stack them at the curb, and on Saturday mornings we get this truck and we go around and we gather up newspapers. We also gathered up scrap metal too. And if you would ask me, well, what did you think those things were going for? We would have at that age interpret those as, these are bullets to kill the Japs and the Nazis. And that was our contribution to do that sort of thing. The second thing that I did was we had a victory garden. Everybody had a little piece of ground that they grew vegetables in, and I did the same thing. And the victory garden consisted of a plot that you'd put your vegetables in, and you'd put a stake in the ground. You'd take an old can that had beans in or something like that. You'd paint the can red and white, and then you'd put a big V on it. And you'd put that over the can, and that designated your victory garden. I felt that this was a community project. Everybody was doing it. It was a way of unifying us, and so we all did it. And it brought us all together, and that's really what it did. As a Boy Scout gathering up the newspapers, perhaps we would have done something else. But since that was for the war effort, then that unified us, and the town was all behind us. We didn't have to go out and advertise or say we would like to have this or that. Everybody knew to do it. So the whole project, both the gardening part and the gathering, was a very unifying thing for the community itself. And we identified that with a unification of the nation also. There was never any doubt in my mind that I was going to get drafted. And when the war ended was something I didn't really think in terms about, but I knew that I was going to go into the service. One of the interesting things that, as a young kid that age, that impacted me tremendously was going to seeing the news on Saturday afternoons at the movies and seeing the Bataan March. It must have made a tremendous impression on me, because all those years prior to the end of the war, 43, 44, and 45, I was scared to death of when I knew I was going to go in the service, but I didn't want to go to and fight the Japanese. Going and fighting the Germans, I had no problem. But fighting the Germans because of this, I used to even have nightmares about it. Somehow, as portrayed by the film The March, and probably it was also enhanced by the movies also, not just the newsreels, but the movies. And seeing these young men fall down, exhausted, being shot because they couldn't get up, this kind of thing, the terrible treatment. And also, we all knew about how the Japanese treated their prisoners. It was a carryover from earlier when they fought the Chinese. And we all saw pictures of the Chinese and how they manhandled, raped, killed, murdered the Chinese, civilians, and that sort of thing. And that started it off. So it wasn't a very big leap to see what they would do to us. We never really had information like that about the Nazis and their treatment of prisoners. We knew that lots of them had escaped, but it wasn't like it was just a world of difference. In 1943, I had a cousin visit me who was an RAF pilot. He was Canadian, and he was going over to Britain to fight in Battle of Britain, and he stayed with us about 2 weeks. And one of the things that I remember asking him was, I was very interested in airplanes. I used to build airplanes, all kinds of models, and that's what we did as kids, built these model airplanes. And I said to him, well, what does it take to be an ace? Somehow I was impressed with being an ace, shooting down a lot of Japanese or German airplanes. And he said, you have to have no fear. And all of a sudden, those words, I knew that was me. I had no fear. The world, I could conquer the world. And I knew I would be a very good pilot. I knew I could be an ace. And so it was, if I were going to, when I got into the service, I would have gone into the Air Force with the idea of becoming an ace. Just before the war ended, I went to university, to a summer school, so I'd be ready to get back in school when I got out of the service, because I was going to be drafted that fall. And I can remember that, I knew I was going to get drafted. And so I went to summer school and played a lot of tennis and had a good time, because I knew this was it. By the end of the summer, the war ended, and I just continued with my college education. One of the things that for me personally, I had an uncle who was in the North African campaign, and he sent home big trunk loads of captured German material. And we had a Nazi flag as huge as a wall. It was a giant one. And when I was in prep school, we put this flag up on the wall, and we used it as a sort of like a bulletin board. And anybody that would even look in the room could see this thing. It stood out. The other thing was, he sent these German uniforms home. Well, I used to wear them around on Saturdays and Sundays in prep school. I was a big shot with his German uniform on and the German cap or the helmet and all that. And it wasn't like we were trying to glorify the Nazis. It was a way of showing, hey, we've beaten these guys. Look, we got their stuff. And it was a big thing to do, and it showed that we were winning. And that's how we did that. If you did that sort of thing today, you'd say, wait a minute, that's not the way you do it. But in that time, in that place, that was appropriate, because it was a way of showing we're winning. I can remember I was on a hockey team, and we used to practice hockey. I used to practice hockey in this German uniform. These guys thought it was great. I can't imagine it today, but it wasn't the earrings, it wasn't the tattoos, it was the German uniform I had that distinguished me. Never ever heard a derogatory remark, but I always heard, gee whiz, that's a great flag, So yes, I've heard the other, but never heard the. So that's how I assumed that's the way it went, and that's the way I felt, and I'm sure everybody else felt the same way too. My father was a physician during the war, and early on in 1941, he was about to be drafted. In fact, he had gotten his bags packed, and all of a sudden the draft board said, no, you can't go, you're the only doctor in town. So for those war years, he worked as a physician. And being a physician myself, and knowing physicians and hours that we put in, I learned one thing, never to complain in my life, because my father, for 6 years or 5 years during the war, got up at 6 o'clock every morning and went to bed at 12 o'clock every night, 6 days a week. On Sundays, there was a little time off, and then he worked Sunday afternoons. And this goes on for 6 years. Now, that's the way you worked during the war. So he would start his morning by getting up, being in the hospital at 9 o'clock. He used to give anesthesia, be out of the hospital, be home in his office at 1 till 4 or 5, then making house calls till 7, grab a little lunch at 7 o'clock. He was in the office till 11 or 12 at night, every night except Sunday. He got all the gas he wanted. I mean, he had no problem getting gas, but everybody else had a ration card, and you'd only get so much gas, and it was rationed according to, I guess, certain things you did. But as most civilians who didn't have any job that required a lot of gas got very, very low gas, just enough to get around. Well, since he got all the gas he wanted, and we used to spend weekends at a cottage outside of town, about 15 miles outside of town, we had to get there, and we didn't have gas to do that with. So I became an expert at siphoning gas. Now, what does that mean? That means I cut off a piece of hose, stuck it in the gas tank, and then I'd suck it out till it get just to my mouth, and then I'd put it in the can and fill up the can with gas. Now, in the beginning, I got plenty of mouthfuls of gasoline, but as time went on, I got very, very good at it, and I was an expert at sucking out the gas. One of the other things that, once again, was a little on the shady side during the war that I did, my mother was not available to drive this car to take us up to our cottage. She probably was up there at the time, where she'd go up there and spend some time. So in order to get my brothers and sisters who were younger, somebody had to drive the car. So at the age of 13, I had to drive the car. So I drove the car. So I drove from 13, 14, 15. I drove a car. Now, it wasn't like I drove down a main highway, but it was up on country roads. But the point was, I did drive the car. I drove it at a very early age. It was very important to get away. And then my father occasionally could come up, and we were all up there, and he'd come up and join us for a couple hours, or maybe spend the night or something like that. So we had to be up there, and then he'd come up, and it was a way for him to get a break from time to time, too. Mm-hmm. But he wasn't able to drive us up. She was not able to drive us up, so being the oldest in the family, somebody had to. With the war going on, rationing, all these things that were not normal anymore, so the life was considerably abnormal. This was a way to break away from that abnormality that we were going through. Not that we were suffering or anything like that. That's not what I meant. It's just, it was a change of pace. And we were young boys, and we had this cottage, and it was a great place to go and spend a weekend, too. I was in prep school at the time, and I was in summer school up in New England. And I'll never forget this. We were living in a tent. And I can remember 10 o'clock in the morning turning on the radio to listen to some music or something that we were doing. And all of a sudden, the news came across that they had dropped the atomic bomb. Now, I'm 16 at that time. That meant something to me. I understood that. And I remember that just like I remember where I was when JFK died and where I was at 9/11. All those three events are all pivotal events in somebody's life, and you can always remember just what happened at that time. That meant that the war was over with the Japanese. It also meant to me I wasn't going to have to go over and fight those Japanese. I was sure that was going to end the war. We felt that was it. Of course, we didn't know it. Nobody knew anything about a hydrogen bomb. It was all secret type of thing. But the fact that, as the radio announcer described it, it was so massive and all that, one had to make some assumptions about it. And that's what made World War II different than all the wars we've had since then. This was a matter of right and wrong, black and white, good and bad. Everybody could distinguish between what was good and what was bad. And there was never a doubt, never a question. So when you were fighting for good, you knew you had to win or you were going to win. And that was the way we looked at it. As a kid, I never thought about us losing. I never considered that we would lose. It was just a matter of when we were going to win. Because it was hard to conceive of what would happen if we lost. And therefore, we make the assumption, and as I say, the other thing, it was a black and white, good and bad, evil and good, this kind of dualism. And it was very easy to understand and know that you were on the right side, therefore you were going to win.